On January 16th, at a business meeting in Nassau, the capital of the Bahamas, China's ambassador to the Bahamas, Jiarong, told the Bahamian ministers that their government should sign the Belt and Road Agreement as soon as possible. In recent years, Chinese companies have expanded their economic control in the region by heavily investing in infrastructure such as ports, highways, and resorts. The U.S. government is deeply worried about China's growing geopolitical influence and the strategic risks that could arise in future military conflicts. Less than a month later, on January 14th, the acting U.S. consul in the Bahamas, Kimberly Furnish, spoke forcefully at another event and stressed that the Bahamas, being close to home for the United States, must remain stable and prosperous for strategic reasons. This public confrontation has brought the struggle for influence in the Caribbean between China and the U.S. into the open. In December of last year, the Trump administration nominated former football star Herschel Walker to be the next U.S. ambassador to the Bahamas, pending Senate confirmation. This was the first time since 2013 that the United States has sent an ambassador to the Bahamas. It clearly shows that the Trump administration was determined to secure its backyard by keeping the Bahamas firmly under its influence. The Bahamas is an archipelago with more than 700 islands, a population of 400,000, and a land area of less than 1,400 square kilometers, making it even smaller than the state of Connecticut. However, the Bimini Islands in the Bahamas are only 50 miles away from the United States. This means the Bahamas is not just an ordinary part of the U.S. backyard. It's like a porch leading to it, and it plays an important role in America's geopolitical strategy. In 1997, the Bahamas broke off diplomatic ties with Taiwan and established relations with Beijing. This paved the way for China's investment and expanding influence in the country. Starting in 2001, Hong Kong's Hutchison Whampoa Group took over Freeport, the Bahamas' main port, which is just 65 miles from the U.S. mainland. In 2010, a Chinese construction company invested $2.45 billion in building Baha Mar, a large luxury resort project valued at $3.5 billion. Located in Nassau, the project included hotels, casinos, a conference center, golf courses, and a water park. It was aimed at attracting American tourists. The developer at the time was BML Properties. Around 2010, the China State Construction Engineering Corporation, through its U.S. subsidiary China Construction America, CCA, joined the project and took charge of the main construction work. However, by 2015, because CCA failed to deliver on time, the Baha Mar project was only 97% complete but could not open. BML Properties had invested around $850 million, but due to delays and extra cost demands from CCA, the funds ran out. CCA claimed it needed an additional $54 million to pay subcontractors, but BML discovered that this money was used for other purposes, such as buying a competing hotel, the British Colonial Hilton. By July 2015, BML Properties filed for bankruptcy protection in a Delaware court, marking the official collapse of the project. The Bahamas Supreme Court ruled that China Construction America had caused BML's bankruptcy through fraud and false statements, and ordered them to pay $1.6 billion in damages. Later, Hong Kong's Chow Tai Fook Enterprises took over the Baha Mar project for $1.25 billion through its subsidiary. Chow Tai Fook is a Chinese company with close ties to the government. After taking over, they quickly finished the remaining work and opened the resort. Some analysts believe that CCA systemic fraud was done on purpose so that Chow Tai Fook could acquire the project at a lower cost. They see this as an example of China using economic methods to control key assets. Both the Bahamian and American public reacted strongly to the ruling. Many saw it as a typical case of Chinese state-owned enterprises expanding in the Caribbean, which has only increased the criticism of Chinese investment. The Thomas Robinson Stadium, built with help from China State Construction, soon showed quality problems. Not long after it was completed, issues like peeling concrete, corroding steel, damaged turf, leaks, and aging facilities began to appear. Even years later, China State Construction still had to make repairs, which raised further doubts about the Belt and Road project in the area. These problematic projects are typical tactics of the Chinese Communist Party. They start by spending money to gain influence, and then create issues to take control, like with the resort project. They also keep a strong presence in the Bahamas by insisting that their companies handle maintenance. Now, Hong Kong's Hutchison Whampoa is managing Freeport, and Chinese tech company Huawei is openly rolling out 5G networks in the Bahamas. If China and the United States were to fall out, these infrastructures could be used for other projects. Professor Robert Evan Ellis from the U.S. Army War College warned that these ports could be turned into listening posts during conflicts and used as military supply points, while local networks might serve as spy networks. You might ask, hasn't China already invested tens of billions of dollars in the Bahamas? How are these investments any different from joining the Belt and Road? The Belt and Road is a major plan launched by China to connect itself with the world by building roads, ports, and 5G networks. At its heart, however, it's a strategy to build relationships and expand influence. Although the Bahamas has received a lot of money from China, it has not officially signed on to the Belt and Road. Without joining the Belt and Road, China's investments in the Bahamas are simply individual projects or business deals. But if it signs onto the Belt and Road, it would be publicly recognizing China as a leader and becoming part of China's global plan. Politically, it would mean getting closer to China and accepting a strategic partnership. The Bahamas might then vote with China at the United Nations, support Chinese positions, help isolate Taiwan among its Caribbean allies, and even vote against U.S. proposals, a move the United States would surely oppose. If China wants to push out local Bahamian companies, it cannot simply take them over by force. Instead, it uses schemes. Signing onto the Belt and Road would force the Bahamas to commit to using Chinese companies, repaying Chinese loans, and even prioritizing Chinese interests. This makes it easier for China to control local investments. For example, consider the $3.4 billion container port project in Freeport. If the Bahamas cannot repay Chinese loans once the port is built, it might have to lease the port to China for 99 years. Much like what happened in Sri Lanka. At present, Hutchinson Whampoa manages Freeport, and Huawei is installing 5G networks in a part of the Bahamas that is just 65 miles from the United States. If the Bahamas were to join the Belt and Road, China might invest even more heavily, building deep water ports that can accommodate submarines and aircraft carriers, as well as setting up listening posts that could threaten U.S. security. Professor Ellis warned that in wartime, China could use these assets to cause disruption in America's backyard. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has warned that if the Bahamas dares to sign onto the Belt and Road, the U.S. might raise tariffs and pull its investments there. Alexander Coswell, the researcher at the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, believes this would be devastating for the Bahamian economy. Now, the competition between China and the U.S. in Latin America has reached a new level. Even though American media rarely report on it, China's official responses show that the U.S. is taking an unprecedentedly tough stance in the region. Recently, China's ambassador to the Bahamas, Jiarong, published an article in a leading Bahamian newspaper. When you read it closely, its tone is full of threats. In his article, Ambassador Yan accused the U.S. of malicious suppression. The language has escalated from saying the U.S. was attempting to undermine cooperation to accusing it of taking sides for its own benefit. This change in tone shows how quickly the situation is evolving. Ambassador Yan urged the U.S. to discard its Cold War and zero-sum mindset. According to him, the U.S. is forcing the countries in Central America to choose sides, either completely cutting ties with China or aligning with it, with no middle ground. He even hinted that the U.S. might be setting a countdown for these countries to decide. Most notably, the article deliberately mentioned that China has built various infrastructure projects, like the container terminal in Freeport, just over 100 kilometers from Miami. This mention is not accidental at all. It's a clear threat. He reminded readers that, just as the Soviet Union once deployed missiles in Cuba within 2 years, China has been operating in the Bahamas for more than 20 years. Who knows what might be hidden in those civilian ports, infrastructure, 5G networks, and hospitals? The warning was plain. If the U.S. keeps trying to eliminate China's influence in Central America, then China has the power to create trouble right on America's doorstep. The article also emphasized that the friendly relationship between China and the Bahamas is very solid. This implies that the Bahamian government is still maintaining a close relationship with China. Ambassador Yan chose to publish this article in the Bahamas Forum newspaper instead of in other Latin American media. This decision speaks volumes. Secretary of State Rubio has already visited 5 Latin American countries and gotten them on board. China simply cannot get its message out in those places now. We also see that Rubio visited the Dominican Republic, which is near the Bahamas, but skipped the Bahamas themselves. The reason is clear. The Bahamian government clearly leans towards China, so visiting wouldn't have made a difference. The fact that China could even publish such an article shows that U.S. policies have really struck a nerve. Normally, the Chinese government keeps its protests quiet unless it feels deeply hurt. But the U.S. remains confident. If China ever dared to launch any kind of attack in the Bahamas, China's strategy is essentially to delay the U.S. from clearing out its influence in Latin America. Given the U.S.'s absolute advantage and determination in the region, China's delaying tactics will have little effect. In the long run, the U.S. will almost certainly regain control of its traditional sphere of influence. At the beginning of February, Secretary Rubio toured 5 Central American countries, from Panama to El Salvador, Costa Rica, Guatemala, and the Dominican Republic. On February 3rd, Panama even announced it was withdrawing from the Belt and Road Agreement, choosing to tear it up rather than risk angering Washington and standing up to Beijing's pressure. Rubio was very clear in an interview. "I've got to do what's good for America, not waking up one day and finding out that China has more influence over our neighboring countries than we do, that China has more presence in our neighboring countries than we do." Next, Rubio has clearly set his sights on the Caribbean. On February 10th, a U.S. media outlet reported that the U.S. plans to deploy more MQ-9 drones in the Caribbean. These drones will focus on monitoring port activities around the Bahamas and the Dominican Republic. The commander of the U.S. Northern Command stated plainly, "We're going to keep an eye on every Chinese cargo ship to ensure they do not turn into warships." By the end of 2024, the U.S. Navy upgraded its underwater listening devices on Andros Island, where the Bahamas capital is located. According to CNN, this base can detect submarine signals within 200 nautical miles, stopping any Chinese submarine from sneaking in. In January 2025, Secretary of State Rubio visited Jamaica and signed a $500 million Caribbean Security Cooperation Agreement. In return for helping Jamaica pay off its debt and build a port, Jamaica had to kick out Chinese construction companies. Then on February 15th, Fox News reported that the U.S. pressured the Dominican Republic to pause its 5G cooperation with Huawei or face trade sanctions. So how likely is the Bahamas to side with China? Even though the Davis government seems to lean towards China, public opinion there tells a different story. The Bahamas economy depends on the United States for tourism, trade, and military cooperation. After all, 84% of its imports come from the U.S., and most of the 11 million annual tourists are American. With the U.S. military stationed just 50 miles away in Florida, the Bahamas has little room to defy Washington. China's infrastructure projects might sound attractive, but they often come with delays, poor quality, and disputes that worry local people. Cricket stadiums have collapsed, resorts have gone bankrupt, and even Huawei's network is closely watched by the U.S. Alexander Coswell from the Caribbean Policy Research Institute predicts that if the Bahamas signs on to the Belt and Road, American tariffs would immediately crush its economy. Even if China pours in mountains of money, the Bahamas would never risk turning its back on the United States. Look at the situation in other parts of the Caribbean. In Jamaica, highway projects stopped halfway. In Trinidad, sports arenas have become mosquito nests. And in the Bahamas, unfinished projects are everywhere. While Chinese diplomats praise the bright future of the Belt and Road, local people know these projects serve Beijing, not them. Now consider the Dominican Republic. In 2018, the country broke off ties with Taiwan and moved closer to Beijing in exchange for a big gift from China. Port, power grid, and tourism projects were launched one after another, with investments topping $3 billion. But in 2023, the Chibo Port project stalled due to delays and quality issues. Local protests about poor Chinese goods grew as the country's debt rose to 10% of its economy. Coswell summed it up. China's infrastructure is like a hook to win hearts. From Jamaica to the Dominican Republic, China's playbook is to make big promises, spend money, leave debts behind, and eventually control key assets. There are still 5 Caribbean countries that have diplomatic ties with Taiwan: St. Lucia, Haiti, Belize, St. Kitts, and St. Vincent. A 2024 U.S. State Department report noted that China's investments there hide political motives. China uses economic leverage to win diplomatic support and push out Taiwan's allies. These small nations are not foolish. With the U.S. so close, who would side with Beijing? The lesson from Panama is clear. Taking a clear side has always been at the heart of Trump's foreign policy. It's not just about the Bahamas or the Caribbean, it's a global strategy. You can maintain relations with China, but don't expect any support or benefits from the United States. In the Middle East, Trump's Gaza plan is a clear example. Countries like Egypt and Jordan had to choose a side, support or oppose. The U.S. stops its aid and security support. Europe faces a similar choice. If European countries keep trading with China, join the Belt and Road, or import a large amount of Chinese products, the U.S. might reduce its security guarantees or even slap extra tariffs on European goods. The situation in Ukraine also reflects this idea. Recently, Chinese media have been busy reporting two things. First, trying to smear Trump by linking him to the Soviet KGB, and second, by portraying the U.S.-Ukrainian mineral deal as unequal. But does the U.S. really not know about Ukraine's secret cooperation with China? Trump's administration made its stance very clear. Anyone who chooses to stand with the U.S. will have the U.S.'s support. This applies to all countries, even Russia. If Russia cuts ties with China, the U.S. might work with Russia, set aside the Ukraine issue temporarily, and even offer some concessions. But if Ukraine keeps working with China, then even if Ukraine is suffering, the U.S. stance could change. Under this black and white foreign diplomacy, the Bahamas really has few choices. The country's economic and geopolitical realities mean it cannot truly side with China. With its location, economic dependence, and security concerns, the Bahamas will have to stay closely aligned with the U.S.